The theme of the next session is World War II. Embark on a riveting journey through the annals of World War II in an engaging panel discussion that promises to unravel the hidden narratives and intricate nuances of this pivotal epoch. Our distinguished panelists, each a luminary in their respective domains, are poised to unveil a tapestry of fresh insights and profound revelations. Don't miss this golden opportunity to unearth the multifaceted dimensions of World War II and its enduring impact on India. Join us for a discussion that guarantees not only enlightenment but also a profound enrichment of historical understanding. I request the panelists to come up on the stage, please. K.S. Nair, Dr. Alan Jeffries. I also request our moderator, Colonel Ajay Singh, retired, to come up on the stage, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure being out here and speaking to all of you on a subject which was so far behind and still so contemporary, World War II. And today we have got a very, I would say, a very distinguished and a very diverse panel here with us. I am Ajay, author of the book on India's battlefields from Kurukshetra to Balakot, largely an Indian military historian. So I'm going to speak to you on World War II from the prism of Indian eyes. Not so much on the impact of the battles and all that took place, but the impact on India as such. We have with us Sri Nair, again the author of 3 different books, a very noted military historian who's written a very eminent book on the Indian Air Force, The Forgotten Few, and how the Indian Air Force participated in World War II. He will give you a different perspective, largely on how the operations of the Air Force translated into the IAF in the future years. And lastly, all the way from UK, we have got Dr. Alan Jeffries, a military historian and academician of note, who will speak to us on the approach of battle based on his own book. And in this book, he is going to be covering the training which took place. Remember, those were very critical years when the army was hastily mobilized. How the training impacted itself and translated on the battlefield, and more significantly, how it translated to the training and organization of the army in the future. So with such a diverse background, gentlemen, let me start. And firstly, before I go ahead, let me tell you a little bit of my book, because this is what I'm going to lead on to this. It is called India's Battlefields from Kurukshetra to Balakot, covering 42 of India's major battles. And what I endeavored to do was present the book from an Indian perspective. None of the battles of the great, none of the momentous battles of World War II in which Indian units and formations participated in have been covered in this book. But today, when we speak of World War II, how do I look upon this momentous event, was easily the most significant happening of the past century? Well, it was a battle in which 2.3 million Indian soldiers participated in. The 3rd largest contingent of arms after UK and USA, larger than the forces of France, New Zealand, and Australia put together. These forces fought in the battlefields as diverse as China, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Italy, and then, of course, in the years after the war, remained in Europe for a long time thereafter. They earned a total of 7,000 gallantry awards, including 41 Victoria Crosses. A great achievement, all right. And as has been put across by so many historians, so many writers, had it not been for the Indian Army's role in the Second World War, the war would have taken on a different course altogether, very rightly so. Well, honestly, we saved their skin. The British Expeditionary Force in France, after a defeat in France had moved out in the north, in the Far East, the Japanese had taken over Singapore, Hong Kong, had reached the foothills of Burma before Indian troops were called upon to save the situation. Not save the situation, I would say assist in saving the situation. But gentlemen, at the end of it all, there's a very, as an Indian, there's a very pertinent question which I ask myself very often. Was this really an Indian battle? If you answer that, the British India declared war on Germany and Japan without a single Indian politician participating in the process. The war was, I would say, thrust. Indian officers, men, units, and formations fought very bravely, very loyally, with extreme courage and valor, based on the time-held concepts of Naam, Namak, or Nishan. Concepts which I would say an Indian soldier holds dear to his heart. And when I say soldier, I mean soldier, sailor, airman, everybody. But then, even though all these great events were taking place and we are participating in actions which were helping keep off Nazi Germany at bay, keeping China, I beg your pardon, Japan away at bay, what was the political thinking at that time? The political thinking at that time by leaders like Nehru and Gandhi was the fact, yes, it is not, firstly we said it's not our war, why are we getting involved in it? We said, then when we got involved, we said, okay, we will participate in the war provided we get a guarantee of independence. That was not forthcoming, and that is when the Quit India movement of 1942 also began. But now I want to bring your attention to a very unsavory incident which very few people talk about. While this was going on, besides the 2.3 million soldiers who went to fight under the British flag, almost 35% of India's coal and iron ore, along with vast quantities of timber, jute, cotton, wheat, was being used for the war effort. And that sustained the materials required to fight a long sustained war in Europe and the Far East. Much of it came from Bengal. And in 1942, a famine struck Bengal. That famine claimed an estimated 2 to 2.5 million lives. It was a man-made famine because we had a bumper crop that year, but that crop was all diverted for the war effort. To alleviate that famine, it was proposed that 8 shiploads of grain be sent to India, incidentally Indian grain, which was being sent to another theater, a move vetoed by Winston Churchill. On the grounds, he said, if there's a famine in India, why isn't Nehru, why isn't Gandhi starving? And also, this grain was sent to New Zealand and Australia and kept as a reserve for a future contingency. So what I want to bring out is, though India gave a great deal to the war effort, perhaps its recognitions of it was not an Indian war as such, even though India was not a political nation at that point of time. But the significant aspect is, this helped lead to independence. And more importantly, gentlemen, India fought, or rather Indian soldiers fought the war on both sides. One was 2.3 million very loyal and dedicated officers and men fighting on behalf of the Allies. There was also a contingent of equally patriotic, brave, and courageous men who fought for the Japanese under the banner of the Indian National Army under Subhash Chandra Bose. This force, when it was formed, it just had a force of approximately 2 divisions at that point of time. Their contributions militarily were, let me put it honestly, insignificant. But psychologically and politically, it had a tremendous impact. Because they fought under the Indian flag. And the first Indian flag raised was done in Imphal by the Indian National Army. So what I want to bring out also, gentlemen, is the fighting of World War II in many ways helped India get an independence which we so richly deserved. So when we speak about World War II, it is an event which, when it eventually passed at the cost of tremendous casualties, almost 40 million, if not much, known casualties, its lasting impact was the fact that the colonial empire dissipated. And in a way, it contributed to the independence of India. India's role in it was tremendous in terms of provision of man, material, loyalty, honesty, courage, every respect. But I would say, even at the end of it all, that independence came rather grudgingly. We were promised independence for the role in the World War. But after the war ended, when there was no sign of independence, and the people of the IRA were put on trial for treason, which sparked off a naval uprising. I will not use the word mutiny. It sparked off a naval uprising in 1946 from those who desired independence, which eventually led the British to take the move to vacate India and grant India independence as two states. So the way I look at it, speaking as an Indian historian, besides the momentous battles which were fought by Indian units, formations, and men across the theaters, which helped the Allies stop both Japan and Nazi Germany, the significance of World War II was in the manner in which it speeded up the freedom process of India. That is my perception when I view this event through an Indian prism. We will not cover the different aspects. I shall leave it to the other panelists. But with this start point and with the idea to get the mind sticking on a different perspective of the war, I will now hand over to my two other esteemed panelists, Sri Nair, who will now give us a talk on a totally different aspect of the war, namely the training and the operation during the war and how it impacted, I beg your pardon, of the Air Force aspects and how it impacted itself in the future. Over to you.
Thank you, Colonel Ajay Singh. Thank you so much. And a big thank you to USI and the Manekshaw Centre, and personal thank you to General Sharma and Squad Leader Rana China for the opportunity. So I think there are, I think Colonel Ajay Singh has ably put forward an Indianized narrative of World War II, which is quite widespread in India and has its adherence, it has its justifications, and can be defended. But you know, as always, with the greatest of respect to anyone who's worn the uniform, yeah, there are a few aspects I might choose to disagree with. But I will start by, you know, sort of making those couple of broad points that we discussed earlier, Colonel, sir, and say that for me, a couple of the drivers of my interest in World War II, and these are, this is a subject that I know that Squad Leader China has spoken on in the past. I think India is almost unique among the significant participants in World War II. As Colonel Ajay Singh has pointed out, we contributed a very, very substantial part of the manpower and other resources that went into World War II. But India is almost unique among major participants of World War II in not treating World War II as a defining part of our history. Every other country that participated in World War II in a significant way treats World War II as a major milestone in their history. And everything, and a huge number of subsequent historical developments are dated to from the time of the war, or in some similar phrasing. We alone, among the major participants of World War II, do not do that. And the reason is fairly simple, because World War II was followed within 2 years, again, as Colonel Ajay Singh says, within 2 years of the end of World War II, India achieved independence. India and Pakistan both achieved independence. And both India and Pakistan, and I have said this many times before, both India and Pakistan are extremely diverse countries, and the new governments of these two large, populous, very diverse countries, the new governments had an incredibly difficult task of knitting their populations together, of unifying very diverse populations, right? Not all of which had been under direct British rule. There were large parts of both India and Pakistan that had not been under entire direct British rule at the time, during the period of the Raj. So that was not an insignificant challenge for the new governments. And one way the new governments did that was to emphasize the freedom struggle in both countries, in both India and in Pakistan. The freedom struggle was emphasized to a degree greater than the Second World War was emphasized. So a narrative emerged of India having been a unified country fighting for independence, and that didn't gel very well with the fact that 2.3, or I've actually seen some original sources which show a figure of 2.6 million Indian participants in uniform. And that was at a time when India's population was a quarter of it is today. So 2.6 million participants out of a population that was a quarter of what India is today is the equivalent of 10 million, 1 crore participants today. So India's participation then was the equivalent of 10 million or 1 crore participants today. Right? So, as I say, that narrative, the governments of both India and Pakistan, to a degree, I think, chose to downplay that narrative in favor of a narrative that we had been unified in fighting for independence. Now, a point I want to pick up from one of the very interesting points that was made yesterday about promoting Indian historical thought. Indian frames of thought actually are very comfortable with carrying contradictory points of view in the mind. There are Sanskrit phrases, there are Sanskrit shlokas about reconciling contradictory ideas in your mind. There are phrases, the Bhagavad Gita is full of such phrases. These were brought out in a lot of by a lot of the people who spoke in the session on Indian historical thought yesterday. So I would, again, with great respect to Colonel Ajay Singh, I would argue that the 2.5 million Indians who participated in World War II and their families reconciled an opposition to aspects of empire with a very strong awareness and understanding of what they were undertaking in going to war. India, at the time of the First World War, there were a lot of stories about Indians being, almost unthinking cannon fodder driven into the maelstrom of World War I. In World War II, I think there was the average Indian soldier, and certainly the average Indian officer, was much better informed about what he was doing, and they were taking much more active decisions to participate. So I would say that was true. But then World War II did result in and I will say this, World War II definitely resulted in Indian independence in a way. I would add that that wasn't a given at the start of World War II, because Churchill actually, from some of his writings, appears to have seen the preservation of a certain measure of colonial dominance as one of the aims of the war. In fact, he made promises to the Dutch that Indian troops would help in restoring Dutch dominance over the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. And Indian troops actually did do that for about a year or so after VJ Day, so which is part of of other very interesting stories. But I would say that to go back to my point, at the start of World War II, independence was not a given. To a very large degree, it was American arm twisting of the British to sign the Atlantic Charter, which actually made it impossible for colonialism to continue in that form. So we owe something, India owes something of its independence to President Roosevelt and the United States, as well as to...
Very nice insight you brought out. Very, very nice.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. But to, to sort of tie, anyway, so there are some the things we can, we could discuss, Colonel Singh. But to get back to my particular point, I think as Colonel Singh has pointed out, the Indian Army expanded by a factor of somewhere between 10 and 20 during World War II. And I'm sure that is a part of the reason why there was such a massive training effort, which Dr. Jeffries will tell us about. The Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy, although starting from lower bases, they expanded by even larger factors. They expanded by a factor of about 40 or 50 during World War II. And in many ways, they were transformational in ways that the expansion of the Indian Army was not. And I keep coming back to this point. Precisely because they were smaller arms, they had to have unified messes right from the beginning. Right from the days of number 1 Squadron in the Northwest Frontier Province before World War II had started, the Indian Air Force had one mess for all its communities. The Indian Navy out at sea, there's a wonderful story of one particular Indian Navy ship which had 6 religions represented in its crew, but they managed with 1 cook and 1 galley. So I would say some of the characteristics of India at its best were pushed by the Air Force and the Navy to a greater degree than the Army, simply because the Army had the scale and to cater to its diversity better. So we could talk a lot about the operational details and the acts of heroism that went into into the story of the Indian Air Force and the Indian Armed Forces more generally. But I would say the nation building was happening in the 3 services, and I'll just I'm close to my 10 minutes, I think. So I'll just wind up with a couple of trivia about the Second World War, which I've written about in my book, and which I think are not as well known as they should be. So one of the things I'd say is that from an operational point of view, one of India's major roles in World War II, and this comes as an irony today, one of India's major roles in World War II was to protect China. The Burma campaign was fought to protect the supply lines to China. Make no mistake about it. China during World War II was playing, in the Asian theater, was playing a role analogous to the Soviet Union in the European theater. The Soviet Union was tying down the bulk of Germany's army in the European theater. China was tying down the bulk of the Japanese army in the Asian theater. So protecting China was important. So to the war aims of World War II, and a large part of India's role was to protect World War II. Now, as part of that support to China, there was actually, I think, there were a couple of 100,000 Chinese troops were trained in India, in Ramgarh, in Bihar. There was a massive training program to train Chinese troops in India. These are ironies which sort of people forget about. And I want to add that the Chinese government of that time was not the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China spent most of World War II hiding in caves in the western part of China, and the fighting against Japan was carried out by the Nationalist Party, which a year or 2 after the end of World War II was defeated in the Chinese Civil War, fled to Taiwan, and Taiwan continued to hold China's seat in the Security Council until October of 1971. And I've talked about that in my other book on 1971. So there are a lot of ironies and trivia about World War II history in which the Air Force and the Navy do play large roles, larger than raw numbers alone would indicate, which have influenced India's history. But I think we can all agree that World War II contributed tremendously to Indian independence, and for that reason alone, India should be studying it more than it does today. So,
very nice. Thank you so much. These were wonderful insights. And what I really liked was the aspect of nation building in ships, of having one galley, different castes and communities eating together. This kind of unification, which took place at the unit and ship and squadron level, is what was there in the Indian Army, which what makes it so cohesive even now. Right? So with this, I hand over to the next speaker, Dr. Jeffries, over to you and your viewpoint. We know it's going to be equally divergent, if not more.
Yeah, do you mind if I...
Yeah, sure, please, please.
Well, thanks very much to both of you. You put it very much in the wider context, and I'm going to be talking on a sort of much more micro level. But one thing I just wanted to pick up on was the fact that talking about some of the Indian officers who served in the pre-1947 army, and I read about General Rudra. Oh yeah, I read about General Rudra, and he actually went to see, talk to Gandhi about whether he should remain in the army. And he said it was very important indeed because basically he needed an army after independence. And I think that's probably one point I just wanted to say in what you guys were saying. Sorry, right. So now I'll talk a little bit about training and doctrine in the Second World War. Not a very fascinating subject, but very important in the Indian Army, and I think very important for after independence as well. So military culture has emerged as an important aspect of military history, part of which is generational change led by senior officers. And in the Indian Army, Field Marshal Sir Claude Auchinleck was that senior officer, and he is very important in the first half of the 20th century. And under the Auks' direction, a number of senior officers were crucial in adapting the Indian Army from the 1930s onwards. And I want to talk about one such officer, Francis Tucker, nicknamed Gertie Tucker. He was a real innovator in the 30s. He trained his battalion to a very high level. It was the 1st Battalion, the 2nd King Edward, thank you very much, King Edward VII's own Gurkha Rifles. And Tucker brought in training within the battalion, helped educate education within the battalion. And a lot of his ideas were adapted across the army by the late 1930s. And then at the beginning of war, he became the director of military training. And he was responsible for updating doctrine for the Northwest Frontier and acting as an aid to civil power. But he also started doctrine for jungle warfare, mountain warfare, and desert warfare. So he's right there at the beginning. He's a really important person in the army. And then he's able to actually put a lot of this into practice because he becomes commander of 4th Indian Division in December 1941. And he puts a lot of his training ideas into practice. As soon as he starts in the division, he starts using training instructions. And the division continually is learning the lessons from battlefield operations in North Africa, mountain warfare in Libya, and also in the Italian campaign. And this continues throughout the war. And it's not just in 4th Indian Division this is happening. This is across all Indian divisions in all theatres. And Gertie Tucker is right at the forefront of this important sort of innovation. A lot of it does start in the 30s, but the real transformation of the army is during the Second World War. He's also responsible for actually producing some of these training pamphlets. So he does the one on jungle warfare that goes out to Malaya in 1940. It's very difficult to gauge how widely read it is, but it's based on his experience in Assam in 1919, also his experience of fighting with the Gurkhas in the 30s, and he's very adamant that you have to use the jungle in fighting. And this training pamphlet, it's only 11 pages long, but it's meant as an addendum to field service regulations, which was the doctrine across all the British and Commonwealth armies at the beginning of the Second World War. And this doctrine gets adapted. So there's a 2nd edition after the retreat from Burma, and there's a 3rd edition after the disastrous First Arakan campaign. And here's an example of the 3rd edition, and it's called Jungle Warfare. And the initial edition is, say, 11 pages long, and this one is, I think, 73 pages long. So doctrine is really adapting in this period. And after the first Arakan, the 4th edition comes out, which is called the Jungle Book. And this is meant to more popularize training. Cartoons are used for the first time, photographs are used, and I think it's instrumental in jungle warfare training from 1943 onwards. It's and not only that, it's actually pioneers jungle warfare training. The War Office in London does produce training pamphlets in 1944-45, but they're actually based on Indian Army doctrine, and not doctrine from the British Army, which I think is an important aspect to talk about. After the first Arakan, other changes are made at senior levels. You know, for example, Auchinleck comes back as Commander-in-Chief India. Another person I want to briefly talk about is Reginald Savory. He becomes Inspector of Infantry in 1943, and his job is, well, he served in North Africa, East Africa. He's another innovator like Gertie Tucker. His voluminous papers, very few historians have looked at, and they're held at the National Army Museum. And I think he's a really important character. And a quote from one of his papers, he said, "I spent most of my time not only visiting the training establishments, but also infantry units throughout India. I also made regular trips to the front so as to acquaint myself with the conditions of the time and apply the lessons learnt." And this is, I think, the crux of the matter. The Indian Army in the period, well, throughout the war and even in the 30s, the Indian Army becomes a learning institution. And that's kind of my main point, really. And this continues. So operationally it happens. Recruits now would undergo basic training with jungle warfare divisions. Well, doing jungle warfare with training divisions, the 14th and 39th, for example. Then they go to reinforcement camps, training would continue, and then they'd eventually join their units. And General Bill Slim, commander of 14th Army, and another quote, he says, "Within a few months, the quality of reinforcements reaching from these training divisions through the camps had completely changed, not only in skill, but above all in morale." And this new training structure was massive by the end of 1943, and probably one of the biggest during the Second World War. And just to sort of finish off, by 1945, the training structure across India was huge, with over 900 training pamphlets available at 75 training schools and establishments. They were run by officers that had experience in warfare in North and East Africa, in Italy, in Burma, and I've talked about two of them, Savory and Tucker, for example. But also, in addition to jungle warfare, there were centres for air mobile operations, amphibious operations, mountain warfare in the Italian campaign, but also the open warfare in the Burma campaign. And so I think from 1939, the Indian Army was transformed from an imperial policing force to a modern professional army in 1945. It achieved a new level of professionalism, helped by this learning institution, and become a fully modern, properly trained army capable of dealing with almost any tactical situation with it might be presented. And I think that's just about within time.
Thank you. Thank you. You have brought about something really, really pertinent. Sir. Sir, please, sir. No? Sure. Please, sir.
We want it to be effective.
I don't know how good this.
Sir, it's working, sir. Yes, sir.
Hello. Can you? I'd like to make two observations on hindsight. Notwithstanding Colonel Ajay Singh's reservations, understandably, about India's participation, the political side set aside, there are two observations in hindsight about India's participation in World War II and how we have benefited from it. One is considering the fact that the most significant action that the Indian Army fought as a whole was in Burma. Apart from North Africa, all the way up to Italy, as well as the Middle East, but Burma was the most significant action, the one where the Indian Army stood out. And in fact, in Field Marshal Slim's own words, his finest battalion commanders were Indians. He mentioned General Timmy, Thorat, Sen, and several others. And again, taking off from Alan Jeffrey's point of view, the Second World War, on hindsight, became a great establishment of the Indian military infrastructure. Given that in 1948 and again, after that in the 50s, we had insurgency in the Northeast, 1962, 65, 71, and after that, the Indian Army is one of the only armies that is constantly in combat readiness.
Yes, sir.
So if you treat World War II in hindsight as a great platform from which the Indian armed forces infrastructure, the Navy, the Air Force, we built on it. If you may say, if the World War, if India had not participated, what would have been? That's an exercise in hypothesis. That's a hypothetical. But let's take the
Completely agree with you.
So and that is where India differed from all the other colonial countries. In 1948, we had 2 stars in all the 3 ranks, and we had a certain level of maturity all the way from the other ranks to the junior commissioned officers to higher ranks and the equivalent in the Navy and the Air Force. Unlike other countries, and what was the outcome in other countries? You look at, due respect to Africa and other countries, you had coups that were staged by 2 and 3 stripers who took over with devastating results. The Indian armed forces remained mature and became a solid part of the Indian infrastructure and led to it. The second issue I'd like to say is Burma. Given that the Japanese were at our doorstep, a Japanese, and that was Imperial Japan, not the wonderful Japan that exists today. And that was the worst grade of the European powers as far as Germany was concerned. So you consider these 2 imperial powers, the Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. I think, on hindsight, we were better off with the British. Then, with due respect to the British, my next remark was, we would have been, from the frying pan into the fire had the Japanese had we not held them off in Kohima, and God help what would have happened to us. I mean, it would have been a terrible situation. Independence would have been out of the question. We would have been under the rule, perhaps. I mean, this is again, which is why much as I regard Subhash Bose as one of our greatest patriots, I don't believe the Indian National Armies lived up to the expectations. And unfortunately, a lot of them suffered as a result. And even at the hands of the Japanese, mind you, who didn't treat them well. In fact, at the Andaman Nicobar Islands was a classic example how badly the Indian National Army was treated by the Japanese. So when we... I don't agree with you more, sir. I mean, their objectives were great. So purely looking at it in a niche manner, I think World War II in hindsight did us good, did the armed forces good. We were set off. We had a platform from which to, and in 1948 we excelled ourselves. 1962 might have been a slight blemish, but after that we had the maturity that every country would be proud of. Today, our armed forces. So
thank you so much, sir. I completely agree. And what Alan had said, the trading platform which was set in those days, and the very fact that we are trading in different theaters, from jungles to the desert to overseas, it was led to a professional, strong army which is today. Sir, I think आपको कुछ कहना था?
Thank you for those 3 very nice presentations. Give us a different perspective. But based on that perspective and the contemporary sort of times we're living in, I have 2 observations on which I'd like Ajay and Mr. Nair to please comment. Firstly, we set up a National War Memorial a couple of years ago. Long overdue, 75 years overdue, fabulous monument and a testament to the courage of our soldiers post-independence. We already have a memorial of sorts to World War I. That's India Gate. It may not be complete, but it's there. What about World War II? We have not recognized the sacrifice, the courage, and the bravery of our soldiers, sailors, and airmen in World War II. A lot of us sitting over here are second and third and fourth generation, military people. And it hurts to know that there's a whole period of Indian history, military history, which has been obliterated in this contemporary things. Besides, of course, the regimental histories and all, which have managed to retain that sort of thing. That's number one. So I don't know, whatever your views on that are, how can we address this? Second, of course, training. I think we learned a lot, as Khanna said, we've really sort of learned a lot. There's no doubt about that. So I think this is one thing. And from that comes my second point. Are we sacrificing time-honored traditions of the armed forces, not Indian armed forces, of the armed forces in this so-called drive to decolonialize ourselves? This is a point which I feel very strongly about. Because in this fervor to be ahead of the others, I think we're not going down the right path.
I would agree with you completely in this, and I also agree with you that the individual actions of Indian units, formations, have not been given the respect, the recognition is the correct word, which they deserve, except in platforms like unit war histories and things like this, which are needed. So,
General Bhagat's portrait
Sir.
hangs in the Indian Army room at Sandhurst. And there's, of course, in addition to all the other Victoria Crosses. But here at Manekshaw, we haven't honored somebody like him, who was the first Indian officer to get to be awarded a Victoria Cross.
Totally agreed, sir.
And
these are the contributions that we ought to recognize
I
and
think
accept.
these are regardless of, after all, these were Indian
Yes,
officers who built foundations of our armed forces.
Right, General, I can take one last question before we say thank you. Okay, please. Last one, please. Sir, yeah. Right?
So this is in regard to particularly the V Force, where we know that the Brits trained and worked with a lot of northeastern tribals like Nagas. I'm talking. It's on. Yeah, I'm speaking of the V Force. So my question would be regarding the training doctrine of the V Force. So in V Force, Brits worked with a lot of northeastern tribes, Nagas, Kukis. So there was a lot of language barrier as well. So my question would be, how did they go about training them? And if the British learned something or adapted some counterinsurgency tactics, which they later used in Malaya, from the tactics of these northeastern tribals?
Very interesting. Very, very interesting.
Yeah, I think so perhaps a couple of points on that. I think definitely counterinsurgency, that probably comes after the war. So a lot of, say, the Chindits, that kind of thing, they served in Malaya after the war, and a lot of, and Indian Army as well. So I think there's probably, the counterinsurgency comes a bit later. And the first part of your question was about the V-Force.
How did they
The language.
Yeah, how did they go about training the northeastern tribals with the language?
Yeah, so
barrier?
language is quite an interesting thing because there's always going to be language difficulties, especially in the Second World War, because a lot of the new officers coming in don't know the languages of the regiments, the British officers, that is. But some historians have looked at this, Tariq Bakawi, for example, and have sort of come up with the analysis that it hasn't made a huge amount of difference, some of the language barriers. It's a difficult one to quantify, I think. But I kind of probably go along with what he said.
I could actually answer the question on V-Force.
Oh, well,
So the answer on V-Force is that V-Force units were run by local officers, and for the first time, many indigenous troops were given command positions. If you look at the results of the awards to Indian officers through 1942 and 43 and 44, they were all to Indian soldiers. A large number got IDSMs. So these were members of the Assam Rifles primarily, but also the Assam Regiment, who were given responsibility for V-Force locations, and most of them were given the IDSM. There were no British officers or soldiers. They were all Assam Rifles and Assam Regiment, for which, of course, there was no language barrier. In some locations, there were white deputy commissioners. I'm thinking about people like Eric Lambert in Kohima, but they didn't actually lead the V-Force operations. They were all Indian Army officers and soldiers.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And I should say, thanks very much to Dr. Rob Lyman, and we've actually got a panel on the Burma campaign at 4 o'clock.
Yes, do come along this afternoon, because if you enjoyed this morning or this afternoon, all of the points that were made very well here, we're going to go large this afternoon. The truth is that India and modern India, the India you recognize, and the India that many of these now retired gentlemen served in terms of the armed forces, were made by you in the Second World War. We'll talk about that.
Thank you very much, sir. What a lovely contribution from the audience. And before I wind up, I'd like to thank everybody for presenting such divergent views, and to the audience for amplifying, contradicting them, sir, which is far more important. And Alan, thank you so much for a unique perspective, which is one thing which even it didn't strike me, was the training which was provided. Not the Indian Army was largely trained to the northwestern frontier province in those days, but the training provided in different areas of different terrain, jungles, deserts, the European theater, amphibious operations, and like was correctly brought out, sir, is what perhaps steeled the army to become the kind of a premier fighting force which it is today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a pleasure addressing each one of you, and thank you very much for your invaluable contributions. And most of all, a thanks to each soldier of the Indian Army, Navy, and the Air Force who have made this country what it is.